Welcome to Radical Love Live. We're part of the Choircast family of podcasts.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of Radical Love Live. Today we are talking with our guest, Lori Adams Brown. She does so many things. I'm looking at her bio here. She does so many things. I don't know which ones to cover. She's a business and nonprofit executive, inclusivity specialist with 30 years experience of living and working abroad in Central and South America, Asia, San Francisco area. She has numerous degrees and has working in cross-cultural competency in leadership development. And she is also a survivor of religious abuse and trauma, which we'll also talk about a little bit today. But Lori, welcome. I want to give you an opportunity just to tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're up to these days.
Yeah, well, it's great to be here. I love podcasting. I host a podcast myself. It's called A World of Difference, but that's not my full-time job. But I do love it. It's a passion project of mine. I work here in Silicon Valley in a tech company, and I'm over all of our global leadership and development and our training. So I have a global team that I work with, which means, sometimes asking my team to be up in Taiwan at 5 a.m. and the other part of the team up in the UK at 10 p.m. and trying to make it all work with my US-based team in both coasts. But I do love it. My life abroad really helped me understand that there's so many different ways to live this human life. And I think there's so much beauty in the diversity of it all and different perspectives. So I get to be involved in that both in my job here in Silicon Valley and the podcast I host called A World of Difference, where we bring our differences around the table to make a difference together. And as you said, I'm a survivor of religious abuse and have worked through about 3 years and lots of good therapy to heal myself enough to be able to tell my story and advocate for others, because the nature of my story is part of it is ongoing and it intersects with some of the things happening in the Southern Baptist Convention now. And it also positions me in a space because I'm a few steps ahead to help those who are wanting to heal or even whistleblow, which is something that I did. To help people walk through that.
Wow. Well, there's a lot there to unpack. And as you mentioned, the Southern Baptist Convention is going on right now as we speak. So we're waiting to see what developments will happen there. Some interesting characters will be parading through there this week. It sounds like you've got feet in both the religious and church world and the sort of more secular tech world. How do you relate those two with one another?
Well, that sort of happened by choice and not by choice. So, I grew up the daughter of missionaries who were also, there's different type of missionaries out there that my family, I was raised Southern Baptist, born into it. My dad was a pastor in my early years. And then when I was young, we moved to Costa Rica and I was in international schools and elementary school. And then we moved to Venezuela, which is where mostly I grew up. And my friends were from all over the world with all different faith backgrounds, teachers, the same. And and basically that helped broaden my horizons of as a young child about not only different ways to live this human life, but the beauty of different perspectives that people bring. And so I was involved in Model UN in high school. I had great teachers that taught me to think critically, to ask questions, and that curiosity really leads to knowledge. And so I've always approached my faith and my life and my work with a lot of curiosity. But there were spaces in my life that, especially in the Southern Baptist realm, toward the end before I left that denomination after many years, over the abuse and cover up and all of that. I did spend my life in ministry, even when I worked overseas. So I have a seminary degree. I have a master's in intercultural studies. I ended up going to Venezuela, being recruited to a Southern Baptist university, which was on the more progressive side in the 90s. And I got a full leadership scholarship there. So I was involved in these leadership retreats and got a lot of knowledge and mentoring around how to lead with integrity and based on values and that kind of thing. And it really, that investment was amazing, not just because my parents raised me that way and I was involved with the work my mom did, for example, of starting a free clinic that still exists in Venezuela for people to be treated for free. My parents were just the kind of people that got in there and did good work to help people flourish. And understanding that the gospel is more than just words, but it's your actions and really changing systems in ways that you can, right? And that kind of justice work. So that's kind of in my bones. And I was raised at a time in the Southern Baptist world that wasn't like how it is now. It's, the Southern Baptist Convention has decreased in numbers, largely over the mishandling of abuse cases and covering it up. And then an increasingly complementarian theology that over time, some people may or may not be aware of the history, but there is this conservative takeover that happened with Dr. Paige Patterson and Paul Pressler. Paul Pressler being this judge in Texas who had abused many boys and young men over the years, and it was sort of covered up all this time, and then Paige Patterson having covered up sexual assaults on the campus of Southwestern Seminary, and I was one of the people that signed the petition for him to be removed when #MeToo and #Church2 was sort of coming or being born. And so these two men who led this conservative resurgence were abusing, covering it up, and sort of, subtly and not so subtly training a whole almost generation of pastors and seminaries with these methods. And so we have sort of the fruit and the result of that and many other things that we could go into. But the reality is that increasingly over my time where I was working in a Southern Baptist institution for ministry overseas. So I worked in the International Mission Board in Indonesia and Singapore. That was a total of 20 years. My husband also is a missionary kid who grew up Southern Baptist missionary kid in Asia. And so, we were sort of in that world. And there was a lot of nuance in the beginning where you could have different theologies. I've always been egalitarian. I was appointed with the International Mission Board before the BFNM was rewritten to say more strictly in I guess 2000 it came out. I was already overseas when it happened, where Paige Patterson and Al Mohler and Dorothy Patterson, Al Mohler's wife, were involved in rewriting this, Baptist faith and message, which had been there for years, and have allowed diversity, and suddenly it was more narrow. But it was the kind of thing where it's like, well, if you agree with most of what it says, more than 50%, then we're still mostly in agreement. So it was sort of like, okay, I'm just kind of this unicorn that doesn't really believe I would word it that way. I also don't believe you should have to worship on Sundays. We lived under Islamic law, so we would worship on Fridays. There were things in there. It's like, well, is this a really hard and fast rule or is it not? But over time, I think a lot of the people that had been egalitarian sort of left. And then by the end of my time there, I was in Singapore and I was recruited to become a pastor as a woman at a Southern Baptist church in Silicon Valley, where I live now. And so this happened right before COVID hit in the late 2019. And I was recruited by Andy Wood, the pastor at the time and founder of Echo Church here in Silicon Valley. And he was really positioning himself to start fighting the Southern Baptist Convention on behalf of having women pastors. And so he recruited me to come and be the second woman pastor at this megachurch here.
Oh, so he was fighting for having women pastors.
You caught that? You caught that? He was fighting for us, apparently.
Okay, all right.
And apparently still is somehow. But I would label this with all my therapy and my conversations with women like Nancy Ortberg, who was abused by Bill Hybels, and other survivors who have spoken to me about not only their megachurch pastor abuse, but just the process and more understanding. I would label that as a grooming experience of being, told certain things and overpromised and underdelivered, and that got me here. And then into my time, several months in, I asked a question in a strategic leadership team meeting, and a question that was just a polite, innocent question, because Andy Wood said he was going to open the campuses up in summer 2020. And all of us had the question anybody would have about, oh, are we allowed to do that? Like, tell me about, it was just the obvious question. Right. But what I didn't know is you don't question. And I got badly abused, intimidated, bullied, coerced, name called one-on-one in his office where he broke his own Billy Graham rule, and just it was like so psychologically unsafe. And it culminated in a large mobbing meeting. This kind of went on from about August to December, and it culminated in a surprise sneak attack ambush meeting between him and Felipe Santos, who's his high school buddy and current pastor of Echo Church, after Andy went to Saddleback to replace Rick Warren. And they mobbed me like a few days before Christmas, and I had a dissociative experience from the trauma of how these two men were just berating me the entire time. So I ended up later calling out the abuse, and in retaliation, they fired me and my husband, gave us NDAs tied to severance, which we didn't sign. So we foregoed medical insurance for our family with 3 kids in COVID during school shutdowns, and not knowing if we were going to live under a bridge, but just realizing that, my voice isn't for sale. And so that was a hard choice, but then got blackballed by him and Felipe trying to get other jobs. And so ended up just working in a tech company, just saying, you know what? I don't need to be in paid ministry. I've never needed that. And it turns out, women are much safer in tech with Bro Club than I was in the Southern Baptist Convention in a megachurch. So.
Wow. And that's saying so much for, for those who know that, that tech culture, and how difficult it is for women to break into that area. There's so much there to unpack. And first off, I'm really sorry that you experienced that. There are a lot of people who because of abusive or traumatic situations in church, have, they'll turn away from their faith altogether. They'll be like, how can God allow this to happen in this institution that's supposed to be his house? Have these experiences affected your faith?
Yeah, I get the question a lot, and I actually love the question because I feel comfortable talking about my faith. I know that some survivors feel like that's a very private conversation, but for me, I don't know, I'm just really extroverted, and I kind of process it out loud, and I've kind of always been that way about my faith. I would say, if I could give just a couple words, that it's deepened my faith. I never needed megachurch. I wasn't raised with that. I was raised in house churches in Venezuela that were very meaningful and still are. Did a lot of house church overseas under Islamic law. It was I never needed it to be big or splashy. I never needed choirs and choir robes. I never needed smoke and fog machines. I never needed lights and all of the trappings. I just didn't. That was never really part of my faith. I could worship in those places, and I did work in an environment where I was on that stage and there was fog machines, and sometimes it was hard to breathe, if I'm being honest. But I never needed that. And so in the aftermath of it, what has changed is my nervous system reacts to that, and it's not my choice, but because of the trauma and the way the body keeps the score and the way psychological and spiritual abuse can really rewire your nervous system while it's healing. I can't be in an environment that smells and feels like that one. And I've tried to go to conferences, and my trauma response is to flight into the lobby. I can't hear the songs because they trigger. I've done 3 years of intensive therapy, DBT therapy, somatic practices, and still in the midst of EMDR just to be able to drive by the campuses, which I still can't do, of the church. And I know survivors of Echo Church. We call ourselves Echo Survivors, and we have a petition with about 1,600 signatures where we're still trying to get Felipe Santos to release the NDAs. There's so many NDAs, wow. And for years they still won't release them, which is another way Rick Warren was complicit in, bringing my abuser to replace him and ignoring all of our stories. Many of us tried to share our stories, but we were ignored. And there was false narratives spread that the NDAs were released, but they still have not been, because I know these people personally, so many of them. And so, I can't, many of us Echo survivors, some people will be 7-8 years out and they still can't drive past the campuses. So and I know 4 women, specifically who worked with Andy Wood at Echo Church in various capacities, who started having panic attacks around him, and for years later still have panic attacks and trauma nightmares about meetings with him or meetings with Felipe Santos. So if you don't understand nervous systems, I didn't understand it either until it happened to me. And so my I have found a lot of healing and beauty in the beach, which I do know regulates our
Hmm.
bodies. And so a beach has always been my happy place, but it's a place I can go to in my mind. And I do happen to live close to a beach. But I spent a lot of time reading my Bible, reading Job. When it all happened, when I got fired, I just started reading Job and would read it by the cliffs of Santa Cruz, watching the ocean ebb and flow. And there's a healing nature to that. And it drew me into God as creator. It drew me into the mothering side of God, the mother hen who gathers her
Hmm.
chicks, which Jesus himself quoted out of Isaiah. The spirit of God, that's a feminine word in Hebrew, that hovered over the waters as creation was happening. And just, the way, like a weaned child longs for milk of a God-like mother, that God is a parent, but both forms of humanity were created in God's image. As a woman, I'm created in God's image. As men are created in God's image. And there's a beauty and the egalitarianism of that we're equal before God. And there's a beauty in the fact that we bear God's image, whether we're male or female. And I think that after finally leaving that environment, which was a faux egalitarian environment, I was brought in to supposedly be fought for by this man, and he ended up fighting me and silencing me. And I was used as more like a token to be put on stage, like a trophy pastor. Look, we're egalitarian.
Right.
When in reality, I never made any major decisions. I did not have, I was not asked, how is it going as a woman pastor here? In a system made by men for men, where I was bleeding from 1,000 paper cuts. I was demonized for even, wanting to have a conversation about it when it wasn't even really happening. So part of the abuse in that mobbing meeting in December of 2020 was Felipe Santos starting off the meeting saying, "What is the wound that makes you want to talk about women?" Which I didn't have an answer to.
What?
And then he said, "No, yeah." And he said, "No, what is the wound that makes you want to talk about women?" He repeated it. And I was so confused because I had my pen out. I was told it was a meeting about my new
Right.
role. And then we never discussed my new role. And then he asked it a third time, "What is the wound that makes you want to talk about women?" And that's when I realized, oh, this is not a logistics meeting. This is something altogether different. And I'm under attack. And I did not feel safe to be in my body as a woman or as anything at that point. And I'd had multiple meetings in that office already where my nervous system was scanning the room. Now I understand this. My nervous system, like all of us, are scanning the room at all times. And even though we're not conscious of it, we're trying to decide, is this safe? Are we safe? Are you safe? And having been in that room and one-on-one with Andy, where he was rapid fire questioning me, like, what do you believe about abortion? What do you believe about critical race theory? And I didn't know why. And my voice didn't matter. Sometimes they'd have lunch for me and I didn't know it was a lunch meeting and I had lunch plans with someone else, or, my voice didn't matter. And so I didn't feel safe in this environment to be myself. But in the aftermath of it, the way my faith has changed is that I do spend more time connecting with God as not just male, because God is transcending gender, but understanding and deepening my understanding of God's, the male, female aspects of God that became a part of us as humans. And so that has given me much more psychological safety to be gathered as one of those chicks by a mother hen God, who has helped me and my nervous system heal with God's warm heartbeat. And I have done that less in spaces with large groups of people and more individually connecting with God. And it's been very special. And I've had some very special experiences on beaches in particular, wrestling and then working through trying to get angry, which was a hard one for me, as I wasn't allowed as a white evangelical woman to express anger. And so that's been something I've worked through in a cohort called Caneo, which I highly recommend to people, based in Puerto Rico, started by Dan and Tanya White Jr., who are also religious abuse survivors. They started this retreat in the rainforests of Puerto Rico and have cohorts for people who've walked through this in ministry. And I had a great cohort of people, and my leader, Sid Hawksclaw, was really one who helped us unpack our nervous system and invited me to express my anger to God on a beach a couple years ago. And it was hard. And I did it. And God and I have moved further in our relationship and deeper in my faith because I could bring my full self in ways I couldn't before.
Wow. That's an amazing, what's just full of amazing insights. I'm so glad to hear you bring up the nervous system. We're big fans of The Body Keeps the Score, and some other books and thinkers along those ways, but to remember that we are embodied people and that our mind and our body and our nervous system are connected. From what I've heard in stories of religious abuse, religious trauma, there's a lot of spiritual bypassing. Just kind of pray for it, pray it away, or you need to forgive your abuser, and a lot of these things that are not any way to actually process and metabolize and move through the abuse to be able to come out on the other side with some healing, but are ways to just kind of like tuck it away or pass it by. And from what I've heard in my own experience, it always comes back unless you face it.
No, absolutely. It does come back. And there is a lot of spiritual bypassing. And the one I've experienced the most would be, it's sort of victim blaming disguised as spirituality. And the most common one I have gotten is a push for me to initiate reconciliation, which anybody outside of the system would likely recognize how inappropriate it is to say. I mean, if you saw somebody get run over by a car and they're laying on the ground, would you walk up to them and say, hey, you need to go try to reconcile with the person who ran you over?
Mm-hmm.
It's crazy, right? But in the church, like, first of all, forgiveness should be the one who abused should seek the amends.
Right.
And especially a pastor, especially a person in spiritual authority who has done that to somebody with a different power. In my case, it was a man, the founder and lead pastor of the church, who, with his high school friend, who's an executive pastor, they're both abusing me together. So two men, the two most powerful men in the church. I'm a woman, one of only 2 women on staff, in a system that's brand new, brought in women, broken a glass ceiling. We're still getting cut and bleeding out.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's addressing that issue. My voice isn't really welcome, and the power differentials of that. So people who would say, hey, you need to go to Andy and seek reconciliation, even for that person to approach me, either Andy or Felipe or their wives, who Stacy Wood was in a meeting at the end and had been my friend. Any of those people, they said, hey, it's time to reconcile. Also not okay. It's you start with an amends, but it's so I've seen this and I've seen it in so many stories, not just mine. There is a system in the Southern Baptist that I don't know where it began, but we did have Paige Patterson and Paul Pressler involved in this for a long time. So a lot of that Darvo, the whole, way of switching a victim to offender, right, the victim blaming, tactics have been implemented by these 2 guys and taught at Southwestern Seminary, a place my abuser went to seminary, and, both of them did. And so whatever subtly was being communicated, whatever systems are being put out there, we're still seeing this common story of victim blaming in the aftermath of saying you need to go reconcile, or a vague outreach on, some open, communication to a church that says, well, I've sought reconciliation and they're unreasonable and they, won't reconcile. When there's been zero effort to make amends, when there's been, hey, could I pay for your therapy? Or I'm just even the basic, I'm sorry for what I did to you. Like, that's where you start. Now, does my healing require them to say they're sorry? Absolutely not. I've been healing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I've been starting healing since the hour after they fired me and my husband, and we thought we were going to live in. I started to make a choice. I'm going to heal, and it's still a journey. I don't need them to say sorry to heal. But for reconciliation to take place, I would need something.
Right.
So for people to come to a survivor and say, you need to go reconcile, or for an abuser to say, hey, it's time to reconcile, without the step 1 of minimal, here's what I did, owning the harm, asking for forgiveness, creating a psychological safety where you could even have a conversation with a party present with you that you feel comfortable with. Part of my abuse was I was mobbed by 2 men flanking me on both sides and ambushing me a few days before Christmas alone. And so I should have had at least an HR person, or I should have been able to invite someone else. They didn't even tell me what the meeting was about. They told me a complete lie, saying it was called your 2021 roll, which we never discussed. So all of it was lies. And So who's going to trust any reconciliation process that is going to be honest and truthful when it doesn't begin? So there's a lot of spiritual bypassing that happens. Just people don't even think about it. And I think some of the factors are often victims and survivors are chosen by a
Oh,
predator. I
wow.
call them predapastors. They're chosen because predators have this instinct to know who will easily forgive them. And I'm one of those people.
Mm,
Like, I forgave them within 24 hours of what they did. I don't know if I should have. I was actually coached by someone who's been a spiritual abuse survivor, and I walked through a cohort of leadership with her for a couple years and did some retreats. And she said, Lori, why were you so quick to forgive? You know, Jesus died and bled for that, and you just snapped your fingers and forgave something so horrible so quickly. You know, he didn't step on your toe.
mhm.
He like blew up your life.
Right.
And you're just like, fine, I forgive you. And so I had to go back, and I'm still processing a deeper, slower process. And I wasn't given skills for that. I was always told, if you don't forgive right away, you're drinking the poison yourself. And so it has made it hard to heal because and it made me more vulnerable to a target like that because I excused everything he did as a bad day, it's hard to run this church. So forgiveness has not been my
Right,
issue.
right.
It's not my issue. That's something I did maybe too easily. So for people to spiritually bypass survivors and say you just need to forgive, and why are you so bitter? Bitter being, and then the Bible, sadness, wearing sackcloth and ashes. And yeah, I would think all of us would be bitter in that regard. And I have been sad and upset. And, you know, why? God, why? You know, that's bitterness, not a hard-heartedness toward forgiveness or seeking a vendetta. That's not what that means. But there's a lot of victim blaming with those words, bitterness and unforgiveness, which in my situation, and I know many survivors, that's not true. So it's a way the system, when you have a bully on the playground and you're in elementary school, he's usually not alone. He gets a little gang
Mhm.
around him. And when they become men with platforms and pastors, they're predapastors, they're a little gang of yes men and elder boards and people in the church that are trying to protect the institution, they gang up on the victims too. And so that's been a little bit of my experience. And I would say that's pretty much what's going on in the Southern Baptist Convention right now. So Krista Brown, if you haven't read her book, Baptist Land, I got an advance copy and she's been on my podcast. I did a 2-part episode. Episodes 188 and 189 feature her. And the first one is more her story of childhood sexual abuse from a pastor who's never been, you know, really held to account for what he did to her as a child. Horrible, horrible stuff. And she was such a good girl, and it just ruined everything. And she was the first to bring her abuse allegations to the executive committee of the Southern Baptist Convention, a brave, courageous woman, a lawyer, so intelligent, a great writer. Her book you will not be able to put down.
Mhm.
And then she detailed also the history of what it's been like to approach them. And to this day, they basically closed the committee that a couple years ago was formed to make this list of predapastors and even just people who've gone to jail. Like, no one's on a list. Like, there's so many just easy ones to put on a list, and no one's been put on a list. So the system keeps abusing, keeps covering up. And what you'll see at the Southern Baptist Convention right now is that they're supposedly fighting for or against women pastors, and all a distraction from what should be talked about, which is the abuse of women and girls and men and boys that has been covered up for years.
Wow. And it sounds like, you know, to go back to something you were talking about reconciliation, and, you know, for someone to say, I'm sorry, would require for them to acknowledge that they've done something wrong. It sounds like there's a culture going on where, for some reason, these guys aren't able to see their behavior as something wrong. What do you think is going on with this culture that's allowing what any, I think, normal person would see as bad behavior, certainly unprofessional?
Yeah, it's the question,
Yeah.
right? It's the question on the outside. Inside, it can feel a little bit culty at times, and you don't even realize it until you're out. But there's a lot of insider talk, like, well, people are questioning from the outside because it's, they're jealous, or it's so much better in here, or we're such a big this or that. But when you're on the outside and you realize, oh wow, there is a lot of Theo bro kind of culture going on where when you have a system where it is this sort of hierarchy where women are considered basically second class citizens. I mean, people wouldn't describe it that way within complementarianism, but when you see a hierarchy, sort of like that Bill Gothard umbrella of God over a man, over a woman, which it's not even how rain works. I don't really understand
Right.
that. And
I've seen that
that's a whole other
diagram.
conversation. Yeah. And so much of it, Kristen Covaz-Dume in the Happy Shiny Happy People documentary pointed out that really intersected with Southern Baptists for a huge chunk of time. And so that was very influential in this theology. And so when you have a situation where men are seen as closer to God or these quote unquote spiritual leaders, which is not biblical language at all, that's superimposed on the text. And people interpret like the word head in English without understanding the original, which could mean source. It could mean all kinds of things. When people look at the word, the word that says women can't have authority over a man, that's authenteo. It could mean all kinds of things. We don't really know because it's only used that once and seems to indicate in other sources that it meant to be overly domineering, which no one should be. But it doesn't mean women can't teach.
Right.
I've also been like, can women sing? Can women cry? Can baby girls cry in the nursery? At what point can women not have a voice in the church? And so like, the logical conclusions are all over the place. But all of that to say, there's been, at least this generation, especially since the conservative takeover, which they would refer to as the conservative resurgence. But I was raised by parents who didn't agree with it, so we called it something else. But since this, younger generation of especially millennials and now even Gen Z have been raised in a world where they don't know there was a diversity of thought and theology in the Southern Baptist Convention. It's so much more narrow. It's also decreased in number now to 13 million. It used to be much larger. And actually it's below 13 million now. And so you have a whole group of people who've just seen men as the spokespersons for God more than women. That, a woman can say this or that, but really, why would you listen to her? Because a man is closer to God. I mean, that's the logical conclusion. If men are the spiritual leaders in the home and women shouldn't make decisions on their own, does she need him at Bed Bath & Beyond to pick out a comforter? Like, what decisions can she or not make? Like, no one's clear on that. But the reality is her voice and her thinking is flawed somehow, less than what a man's would be. So people just center men. And even in the conversation around women pastors last summer, if you look up videos of what happened in the Southern Baptist Convention in New Orleans last summer, where this law amendment was being voted on, which is going to basically oust churches with women and the pastor title. We're not even talking about lead pastor only. It could be a children's pastor. It could be an associate pastor, which is what I was. Any of those titles. So even complementarians, which Andy Wood and Rick Warren would both be in the camp of, still complementarian in the sense of men being lead pastor. So that's where Andy is, that he's a complementarian in his home. He believes he's the spiritual leader over his wife. So that's why to call these men egalitarian is not who they are. It's a very faux egalitarianism. So for Rick Warren was at one microphone, red-faced, passionate, hysterical. Al Mohler is at the other microphone, red-faced, passionate, hysterical, speaking about women. Where are the women? Where are the women at Saddleback that are called pastor? And why are they not there to speak for themselves? Number one, maybe they're not psychologically safe, yes. But if you had a Rick Warren standing beside you, would that be different? Or if he quoted you, or if you wrote his script. But the reality is a man's voice is being centered in this environment almost all the time. Krista Brown, is she speaking? She's doing a little side thing in Indianapolis about her book with Sarah Stankorb, who wrote the book Disobedient Women. Who's a great journalist, and I had her on the show as well. And both of them are doing a book event on the side. Southern Baptists, even though her book is doing really well, are still not going to be bringing her in as a subject matter expert on her own abuse, on the large amount of work and years that she's put together to try to stop this against all odds while they demonized her. So in the middle of all this, no, men don't think they're wrong. Men think they're closer to God, especially the Theobros who have doctorates from Southern Baptist seminaries, which at this point, I mean, there was a time in Southern Baptist seminaries where the education was more robust. When you had Dr. Molly Marshall at Southern Seminary, for example, my dad had her as a professor. When you had more diversity and a truer education, but when you have mostly men, very narrow perspectives, there's not a lot of critical thinking in these seminaries. So for these men to come out with these PhDs from Southern Baptist seminaries and act like now they're especially closer to God because they know all the theology there is to know, and you'll hear Al Mohler speaking even this week about what's going on, and he used to be egalitarian and he switched when the conservative resurgence was happening, and many people around him described him as an opportunist, and he's now the one who's is on this panel inviting Donald Trump in to speak virtually at the SBC in a few days. And so it's power, it's domination, it's probably a lot of narcissism that refuses to believe they've done anything wrong. Because if a woman questions a man, I was called Jezebel. I was
Oh my
not
gosh.
allowed to go back to the staff meeting after I was fired. They told Felipe Santos, and Andy Wood stood up and told all my peers and colleagues at the church where I had been a pastor that false narratives about me, that my husband and I were leaving to go to a new ministry, that they were blessing us when they were absolutely not
Classic
blessing us.
move.
They said I had gained weight. They told the staff that, which I was like, what? So these pro-women men telling the staff that the woman pastor
Trying
as a way to
comment
discredit
on
me
your
somehow.
body. That's
Yeah. And like, I mean, I've raised my boys. You never call a woman fat unless she's a cute little baby. That's it. You can call babies fat, but other than that, no, we don't comment on that. So yeah, that's how men cannot think they've done anything wrong, because the system gives them a pride in their own knowledge and their own narrow thinking, and people start to admire, and there's a lot of hero worship cultivated by the Rick Warrens, the Andy Woods, the Al Mohlers, who are out there supposedly fighting about women, throwing crumbs on the ground that aren't even lead pastor, and expecting women to be grateful for these quote unquote heroes speaking on their behalf without even quoting them.
Oh, it's amazing to hear them, to hear some of these guys quoting the household codes of Paul and talk about how things are supposed to be structured, but not talking about the women in ministry that Paul talked about, the Phoebe and Dorcas, and even we have later this season, we have a scholar, Mary Magdalene scholar, who's coming on to talk about how her image has been totally maligned through the centuries, and that she was really an apostle and got mixed up with a lot of other things, with this idea of the woman as, the temptress, as the one who's going to mess everything up for you guys, that, if she gets out of line, she'll lead you the wrong direction. They seem to focus more on that than the positive examples and stories of women that they could just as easily pull from scripture as well.
Yeah, 100%. No, I've had different experts on, Samaritan woman and different things come on my show as well. And I think that, you asked about my faith, and I think that those were narratives even while I was still in Singapore and working with International Mission Board. I just, I stopped reading an ESV Bible because I realized they were an unabashedly complementarian translation. I started reading the CEB, which has different backgrounds, translators, including women, but African Americans, Latinos, and different people who bring different nuance into I speak 6 languages. I understand that language matters, right? But, I was no longer buying into this narrative that was increasingly making me feel narrow as a woman gifted by God. And so, in all that, I started to read more authors that were writing. The internet's been really great to give us more resources over the last 10, 20 years. And so there's more available than there was. But yes, absolutely. So my faith has allowed me to, without the constraints of a Southern Baptist denomination, that I had to, be careful who I told about certain things I was reading or podcasts I might be listening to, that I don't really have to answer to anybody. I can just be open and feel free to swim in this vast ocean of Christianity and a long Christian history of women and Mujerista theologians and womanist theologians that I love to read and have really informed me over the last, especially 5 years, but even before that, um, about, all the things that were going on in the New Testament that we don't often hear from a pulpit. And, the last time I heard a message on the Samaritan woman, I was in Atlanta. I'd been flown in from Singapore to speak at a missions conference at a Southern Baptist church. And the pastor spoke on the Samaritan woman, and I just froze in my chair. It's not that I'd never heard a sermon like that, but I was no longer willing to sort of sit and tolerate a man who described the Samaritan woman as this loose woman who, just jumped from husband to husband. She was most likely abandoned by many husbands, a woman in a situation where, she would have been perceived as property by some people. And the way that Jesus so kindly interacted with her and raised eyebrows of his own disciples, breaking this Billy Graham rule, which he never abided by the way, because women weren't temptresses to him. Women were human. And he was a grown man able to control his desires.
Right.
That's the example. And most women I know aren't out there lusting after your average pastor in the church. But the men in the church, even in these supposedly egalitarian churches, aren't going, out to coffee with the women to give them their leadership development, because apparently they could tempt them when the women have no desire to be anything other than a sister. And it makes us feel icky and gross when our brothers describe us that way, and even Jesus did not. So are there many amazing women in the Bible? Yes. I was in a meeting with David Platt, who was our president at the time, and we disagreed heavily on the complementarian and egalitarian theology, but I didn't get fired over it. But I was invited into a meeting in Thailand where I could speak about women in Southeast Asia and our roles. And I just went there with like authenteo, authentane, and epitrepo, and all these words and how I interpret them. And these women of the Bible, and I gave a long list, like Phoebe was taking the book of Romans to preach it to the Roman church. And, how do you describe Romans 16 in any other way other than an egalitarian way? And every man in the IMB should have a list as long or longer of colleagues of women that they could shout out in their own Romans 16, because we are a part of God's work too, and we are gifted by God too. And that felt like a radical thing to say that I might get fired for. So these circles, they did make it harder for me, and now I just feel free to swim in this ocean, which has allowed me to use my God-given gifts in a tech company where people of all different faith backgrounds and cultures and languages come together, and I can develop people as leaders, and I get to use my God-given gifts to help others flourish in their jobs. If you have a laptop or you shop online or you have a phone, my company, most likely, those are one of our clients where we help with the cloud and AI and different things that we're doing with motherboards and servers. And so these are products I can feel good about helping people get because I use them myself, and I work with other image bearers of God, children of God in my workplace where I can help them flourish and be a leader who models values and kindness and psychological safety. So what that's meant is I've been invited by the CEO of my company to work with our parent company, which is a much larger company, to be the global head of our ethics advisors. And so I'm working with having regional advisors in my company where somebody can go and whistleblow about something. Me being a whistleblower in my own workplace and major laws broken against me with retaliation in the form of firing and being given an NDA tied to severance. All of these things are not legal at this point, but they're also immoral and unethical. And my workplace does not do that. And we try to create a psychologically safe place to whistleblow because we want people to speak up in the workplace. And so, when you asked about like transitioning from having one foot in each place, I mean, that's how it works for me. I live out my faith where I am in ways that help people know that they can be who they are. Our workplace is, we're big on like Pride Month all over the world. And we want people to feel free to show up at work who they are. And our president is an openly gay man who's Japanese American. He's married to a man and they have a child. And he's, we have a good relationship. We talk all the time. He's created a company where we have so many people who can show up as themselves and be treated with dignity and respect, whatever their values are, whomever they're in relationship with, whomever they're married to, that these are people that God loves. That's my perspective because I do believe in God. These are people that deserve every ounce of kindness and dignity and to be able to do work in a place where they can flourish and help others flourish. And I just feel that I never needed to be paid for the ministry that I do. And I often get asked, why did you leave ministry? And I say, why do you think I left? Because ministry is wherever people are, and I don't need to be paid for that. And to me, loving people around me and loving myself well are the calls that God has put on our life. And I try to do that to the best of my ability wherever I am, at work, in my community, in my family, and wherever else I am.
Well, that sounds like a much needed area of work. And I know that healing often is accompanied by helping other people as well. And certainly in business and technology, there's never been a greater need for people to feel like they can bring their whole selves to work, their authentic selves, including their spiritual selves. It's kind of artificial anyway to divide up our spiritual life and our work life. I'm looking at the time. We're getting to the end of the hour, but this has been a really great conversation. I've gotten a lot out of it, and I just want to open it up if there's anything else that you want to tell our listeners before we wrap up.
Sure. Yeah. I would love to connect with people on social media. I have a love-hate relationship with social media, not just because I live in Silicon Valley and I know that some of these players are making algorithms to where anger is what gets you out there. And I don't want to be somebody who's, constantly angry on social media just to get more followers. But I also know that there are people out there that are on social media that I would love to connect with. And I'm a mom of 3 Gen Z, and in the early years of some of this stuff, I was a little more like guarded with social media because I'm raising them and I didn't want them out there. So some of my more professional social media is a little bit newer because I had private social media for quite a while. Also because part of my abuse is, people discrediting me, and they love to go after your motherhood for some reason. It's just part of the sexism and patriarchy. But so I try to protect my kids, but I do have some kind of more recently put out there Instagram. So I'm on Instagram at Lori Adams Brown, no hyphen, no space. So you can look for me there. A World of Difference podcast is also on Instagram, which is a world of .difference. And I'm also on Twitter. I've actually met people in real life that I've interacted with over spaces like Twitter and Instagram. And so, yeah, I would love to connect with people if you have anything in your story that I could be helpful with. And I'm in the process of writing out a way to whistleblow in a faith environment. So if there's anything about that would be helpful for you, I'm in the process of trying to figure out if there's literary agents out there that I should be sending a book proposal to. So if you're a literary agent or you know anyone that'd be interested in a book like that, I'm sort of in process of trying to figure out, how to move that forward. Writing the book I wish I could have read. So please connect with me. You can also go to my website at loriadamsbrown.com. That'll all be there. And listen to the podcast. I'd love to hear your perspective on the people I bring around the table because I enjoy getting to know them too. And if you would like to be on the podcast or want to suggest somebody to bring their perspective, I'd be open.
Well, that is awesome. We'll put all those links in the show notes so you can look at your phone or your laptop and pull up those links. But anyway, Lori, thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation, and I'm really glad to have been part of it and glad that we can share it with our listeners. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been an honor.
I do want to add, we will be appearing live in October 17th through 19th at Theology the Camp in Denver, Colorado, with our friends at Homebrewed Christianity and Northwind Seminary and others. Tickets are still available. You can go to Eventbrite to find those tickets, and you can even get a discount. You can get now, it's a $50 discount on the tickets using our discount code, which is Radical Hobbit. That's all caps. And yeah, there is a kind of Lord of the Rings theme. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you there. Thank you, Choir Publishing, for including us as part of the Choir family, and we will see you all next week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Radical Love Live, co-hosted by Mark Dilcom and Kelly Wilson. All rights reserved. You can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, and other popular podcast platforms. Go to radicallovelive.com to learn more about us, watch recordings of our live events, and listen to our podcast. We also invite you to check out what Kelly and Mark are doing by going to our websites, Find Kelly at kellywilson.com and Mark at markdilcom.com. This is Radical Love Live, where we explore faith outside the boxes.